Welcome, everybody, to our final session, introducing Bernard Harcourt, who's moderating.
Welcome, everyone. It's on. It's on. Hello, 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 hello. You hear me now? Yes? All right, welcome, everyone. So, welcome back for our concluding panel of this remarkable and moving and inspiring conference today on what we can do. Now, Marianne Hirschman opened this morning by interrogating the we in the title of the conference name, recognizing the always problematic nature of invoking a we, worried about speaking for others, concerned about the question of the collectivity. We then launched into an extraordinary first panel on protest, activism, and social movements, where some of us, at least myself, almost forgot about the question of the collectivity. With Ayşe Altinay's inspiring discussion of transformative activism in Turkey and Maria Contreras' stirring images of the feminist tsunami in Chile, and Noura Erakat's moving intervention on Palestinian protest and solidarity, and Kianga Yamata-Taylor's rousing discussion of the dialectics of reform and revolution. And then, of course, followed by two other extraordinary panels, and this last one on the arts of intervention, which were both mesmerizing, and many of the works of art that were presented to us were stunning and really moving. Now, at this point, it may be productive to then come back to some of the earlier themes and concerns that were voiced about how to think about the collectivity, about our own actions and our own individuality, about what we can do, what we can do, what I can do, about the overarching questions of truth and politics, and even questions that go to larger questions of critical theory. So we're fortunate, really blessed, to have two remarkable critical thinkers and activists to help us parse through these questions. And I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Judith Butler and Masha Gessen for our panel on facing the present. Brilliant authors, writers, theorists, and activists, both. I would be remiss not to tell you that Judith Butler's extraordinary book, Notes Toward a Performative Theory of Assembly, which we'll be reading for Praxis 1313, is available outside at the book culture stand, as well as a few other of her books. And so you have to pick that up, as well as Masha Gessen's new book, The Future is History, How Totalitarianism Reclaimed Russia, which is now out, 2017, is also right outside for you. So I thought that I would start with the first question. I'd like to start with that overarching question of the collectivity, the we, and of course our own urgent need to do, each one of us, something. There was, of course, no we in the original Lenin formulation, right? Because it was
Russian is
passive.
great that way.
What?
Russian is great that way.
Yeah.
It just avoids the issue of pronouns.
Right, and the passive, which helps us a lot. But there are lots of questions about how do you think that? So this is a question to you, of course, both, starting maybe with Judith Butler. How do you think about your own actions and interventions? Can you tell us what you are doing alongside with others now, whether those activities can be thought of as models for others? And then, of course, I realize, of course, that question itself might need to be reformulated.
Mm-hmm. I think that rather than give a resume of my own actions, I'd like to talk maybe a little bit about the pessimism that is in the title. It's understandably in the title. There's nothing to be done. And to think about what it means to act in the midst of pessimism. maybe not to convert that to optimism necessarily, but to keep pessimism from being hopelessness, which I think is different. Okay, so I would distinguish the two. And I also maybe, and I do want to talk about a couple of movements, but before I do, wanted to suggest this, that somewhere in Nietzsche he says that we go into a crisis about affirming values only from the spectatorial position, that is to say, only from the position of not engaging in the world, but that once you start to engage, the question of what to affirm, what to transform, what to make is a kind of, it's a question in process. It's something you've already taken up. You're already in the process of making values or transforming values in some way. Now, Nietzsche's not my political hero, don't worry. Just make my reputation worse. But I want to say this about it. Many people I know have this feeling that we need to know and we need to see what the larger picture is. In other words, what's possible? Like, is there a radical transformation that's possible? Can we change the most intractable and relentlessly repetitive structures, the structures of systemic racism or of racial capital or of imperialism or colonialism? Is there a large and full transformation that is possible? I need to know that in advance before I could possibly act. Otherwise, my action is reformist or revisionist or small or micro or useless. And I want to suggest that the big picture that some of us at least think we need in order to act at all or to act with the faith that change is possible doesn't actually work like that. We can't know it in advance. And in fact, it starts to emerge in the course of collective actions that gather momentum and that start to produce new forms of imagining. And those new forms of imagining coalesce in time over and against massively reactive forces. They get pushed back, they get extinguished, they get renewed. But I do think that the picture of the future that we might be waiting for in order to act at all is actually one that is made in incremental ways, and that we can't know it in advance. There's something that cannot be fully anticipated or certainly not predicted, right? History doesn't work according to some logic or motor. It's a struggle, if you're on the left, for justice, for freedom, for equality. Those three terms constantly gaining new meaning for us, right? We don't know yet the full meaning of what justice is. We don't know yet the full meaning of what equality is. We thought we knew equality. No, we don't know equality yet. We didn't understand the permutations of racial equality. We didn't understand the permutations of gender equality until certain kinds of historical issues became clear. Do we even know sexual equality? What does that mean? I think that there is a kind of way that activism over time and with others, not as a heroic individual, but with others and in momentum. And I want to say this idea of momentum should never be underestimated because it's the most unpredictable and it might also be sometimes the most joyous, sometimes the most frightening dimension of social movements, but it's there. And when that does start to happen, then pictures emerge, and I don't even know if picture is the right image or story or ideal starts to be generated in ways that I think challenge our previous sense of what is possible. Right? So if we start with the idea, well, that's impossible, radical transformation, that's impossible, right? I'm not doing anything unless it's radical transformation. Otherwise, it's just some small thing, and it doesn't matter. Well, radical transformation actually starts in those incremental ways, and also what's communicable among people and across borders and languages. So, for instance, let's think about Ni Una Menos for a moment, the extraordinary the extraordinary feminist movement in Argentina, but not just in Argentina, but that is moving throughout Latin America, where a group of women get together first to oppose feminicidio, right? And that's an important word because it's not just that women are killed at an extraordinary rate and in a systemic way, and that appeals to the police are impossible because, for the most part, the police are either part of the violence or they tolerate and allow for the reproduction of that violence. But also trans people or people who belong to the travesti community, who to some degree resist the notion of trans. I'm just saying it's complex down there and everywhere. So feminicidio, I mean, this is an important term because it's like everyone who is put in that kind of feminine place or has put themselves there or is perceived there in some way. Now, systemic violence against women. Suddenly, it also becomes about rights to abortion. And they're like, why do you call it reproductive rights? We want a right to abortion. Don't sanitize this. We want to abort if we want to abort. Why do they want to abort? It has to do with our autonomy. Also, our right to sexual pleasure, they say. They're out on the street calling for the right to sexual pleasure, right? That's interesting. Right? We're not doing that so much anymore. Somebody's out there doing it. Someone's really doing it. Okay, but also what then happens next is that that group is suddenly inside the churches because a lot of the women in the churches are mad about what the priests are saying to them about why they should oppose abortion, why they should oppose efforts to get equal pay, why they should not be led astray by the feminists who are decadent and distorted in their efforts to oppose violence. And suddenly, you also have women in unions who form an inter-union network, right? Not a new union, not a feminist union, but an inter-union network which suddenly takes off so that every man in charge of those unions is aware that the inter-union network of feminists is much larger than their union, is much more powerful, is much more vocal, is on the street. And that's in Argentina, but it moves upwards to the point where millions of 2 million alone in Argentina, 2 million on the street. Okay. Do they have a single issue? No. The issues actually start to link with one another. So you've got unionization, you've got a clear class dimension, you've got anti-violence, you've got alliance with trans people, you've got abortion rights and limiting the power of the church, and especially the new beautiful anti-gender ideology that is linking the evangelicals with the Catholic Church in a new harmony, which we should be very worried about.
And the Russian Orthodox Church.
And the Russian Orthodox Church, and throughout Eastern Europe, yes. So, but this has not only moved across borders and languages, but the momentum, the tiempo, what they call the tiempo of this thing, it produces more tiempo, right? And and they lost their vote in the legislature recently to get the right of abortion, as they call it. But are they worried? No, they're going to win next time. Why are they so sure? Because they have tiempo, right? Because it's actually happening. There's no reversal. There's no reversal for them. Okay, it doesn't mean there's not huge reactionary pushback, right? It doesn't mean that they're not defeated time and again, but that resuming the struggle and resuming it with new momentum is part of life. Do they have an end goal in mind? Well, they have certain principles under which they're operating. Do they know what society will look like at the end of their struggle? No. Do they imagine the struggle will come to an end and they'll give up politics? No. It is an ongoing struggle. It is a struggle that they are reproducing and that will be endless, because to the degree that anyone achieves democracy, it is a struggle to achieve it and re-achieve it again and again. Achieving equality doesn't happen once and for all. It has to be achieved again and again. It's a constant struggle. That's what Angela Davis told us. I'm going to be quiet now. Thank you.
So that's marvelous. And And utterly fascinating, before we turn to Masha, utterly fascinating for all of us who are so interested in the relationship between praxis and theory, right? Because what you've really kind of articulated here is something where it's not a question of praxis following theory, but it's really in the praxis itself that we
praxis
are developing.
is the term Marx gives us to move beyond the means-ends framework, right? The action holds the end in itself. Right. It's imminent to the action itself, that end. Right. And I think that is the lived meaning of these movements that take on that kind of quality.
Right, yeah, fascinating. So, Masha.
So, well, first of all, I have to stage a small linguistic intervention. Что делать, the Russian phrase that is translated was to be done as what is to be done, is not passive. It is the infinitive.
Okay.
So it is completely open-ended and uncertain, which I think is as it should be. You know, I mean, I am aware daily that how lucky I am to be able to write about politics here and in Russia more or less daily. And that gives me a sense of being able to act, and that gives me a sense that I'm not helpless. But it also makes me think of, you know, I left Russia 5 years ago, about a year after journalism basically became impossible there. And so I have been able to watch my friends who used to be journalists. And that has really made me rethink some of my ideas about what it is to act politically. My best friend, who was this wonderful journalist in Russia, became, she started working on behalf of severe special needs children who were institutionalized in Russia, and later adults who were institutionalized. And she started a private home for these formerly institutionalized children. So they took 11 children out of a state institution where they were basically confined to their beds. None of them were verbal, none of them were walking. 3 years later, these kids are walking, attending schools, and living in a shared space and acting in that shared space. They haven't stopped having severe special needs, but they have acquired the ability to act and to act together. And my own evolution, sort of watching my friend, was, it's instructive to me, right? I was looking at her starting to do this, and I thought, oh my God, you know, she used to speak to a big world. And how confining is it to work on behalf of, you know, 1 life, 2 lives, 11 lives, I'd said. And I've had a basically 180-degree turn on this, because what I think she and many other people, I mean, it takes a huge effort and a huge fundraising effort and a huge effort, you know, in fighting the bureaucracy and sort of a lot of actual physical effort. But what they have been able to create is a space for these people to live and act together. I mean, that is a political space. It is a space in which they're constantly negotiating how they inhabit the world together. Mm-hmm. And they're constantly negotiating their relationship to the outside world. And so this, as I've observed it, it has, in my mind, gone from this very small thing that replaced her ability to speak to the big world to this very large thing that is an incredible sort of action, an incredible precedent. And that brings me to the much simpler idea that, you know, when we talk about how there's nothing to be done in this country, that's almost obscene, right? There's so much to be done in this country. I've thought a lot and written a lot over the years about what people do when they really don't have options, right? And a number of years ago, I wrote a book about my 2 grandmothers, and what really obsessed me at the time was how they made choices in what I understood to be a situation that offered them no choices. You know, do you want to work? One of my grandmothers was choosing between She graduated from university with a degree in history, and she was supposed to be a history teacher. And then she decided not to be a history teacher because she said she couldn't lie to children all the time. And so she became a censor.
Wow.
And she had an explanation for this. She said, censorship was a mechanical job. There was a list of things that couldn't be published. That list of things was finite. And applying that list was a mechanical job that anybody would have done in roughly the same way, whereas teaching history was an embodied job. She would have used her entire self to lie to children. And so to her, that was a moral choice. And when I was writing about it now, 16, 17 years ago, as long ago as my daughter is, I was really obsessed with the smallness of that space, right? And with my own inability to judge my grandparents' choices because I felt I had no choice. And since then, I've become so much more interested in what they did by insisting on making choices in a situation in which all the options were bad. And I think that is in itself an act of resistance. And it has very particular effects. A totalitarian state aims to rob people of private space. It creates this, it mushes people together, as Arendt said, into one man of gigantic proportions, and it makes everything political in the sense of controlled by the state. And by finding the room between these impossible options, people actually stake out space that's their own. And so I think that there's no excuse for not acting. I think one of the reasons also that I'm sort of so convinced that the question is kind of misguided is that I set out a few years ago to write a book about sort of how democracies start to dismantle themselves. And as I traveled around trying to report this book, I realized that I was not at all interested in writing it. My editor, who's in the audience, is looking very concerned, but she knows there's good news. I realized that I was actually interested in writing a book about imaginative political projects that appear when democracies are dismantling themselves. And I think what we're seeing is not a situation in which we can't act, and what we're seeing is a crisis, which is a time that's very frightening, but it's also a time of great opportunity. And I think we have seen it already in some electoral results. We have seen it in protests. We have seen it in activist projects. And I think what distinguishes those activist projects, and this is where maybe I have a slightly different view, Judith, than you do, is actually a daring vision of the future. Right? The political force that we experience is so disabling is traffics in the imaginary past. And it's the message to that people can be magically transported to a past that never existed, but when they felt comfortable and they weren't constantly confronted with things that cause great anxiety and great irritation. And I think that what we need to fight this pull of the imaginary past is a vision of a glorious future. And I think there are many of the visions possible, and yes, they have to be constantly edited and revised, and they change in the process of activism. But I think that any activism that offers a different way of thinking any particular thing, or conversely, and I think, and I've been writing about this too, or at least reporting on this, projects that have existed, that embody, that contain this vision of a future that we maybe don't quite have the language to describe yet. And so I see it as my job to try to describe it.
Thanks, Masha. So a couple of things. First, as you were talking about your grandmother, right, becoming a censor then, I was actually wondering, I mean, maybe that was actually a more effective form of resistance than being caught in the pedagogic role, I was thinking. So I mean, maybe it wasn't that those decisions are so clear cut, that actually by allowing more in, this might have been a form of protest or resistance or something, right? An individual act of resistance.
I mean, it's hard to see it as resistance, right? When I say that she worked as a censor, but I think it was.
Yeah, right. Well, I mean, it's working from the inside, right? I mean, there's a whole other forms of resistance that are resistances from the inside. Sometimes we look down on that. Sometimes we.
Wait, I don't want to imply that she was in any way a bad censor. Mm-hmm. She was a good censor. She did not fight the system from the inside. She would have been killed, right? She did her job very well. And when I asked her, "How do you know that you did your job well?" she said, "I'm still here."
Mm-hmm.
I took it that the point was that she chose a profession in which she could act mechanically rather than a profession that would wrench her heart all the time.
Exactly.
So she saved herself to some degree.
I think she saved herself, and I think she also gave less of herself to the system.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. But I think we have a productive disagreement on the panel right now about the role of imagining the future and about the role of positing a particular imagination of the future. Because as I was listening to Judith, I was thinking that there's a lot I agree in the idea that we're in constant struggle. And when you're in constant struggle, the question is kind of struggling at that moment without necessarily trying to envisage and impose a future ideal that you've been able to ascertain or get agreement on. Part of it, I suppose, part of Judith's intervention is that it's difficult to get the agreement on that future, so that to avoid kind of spending the time agreeing on a future, we act now, and that those actions are productive in creating forms of resistance. I mean, when you think about the Occupy movement, right? I mean, the idea that there was an openness to ideological positions, right? That there wasn't going to be a charter of what things would look like, but rather it was going to be a general assembly where people were speaking the present or prefiguring or instantiating new relations without an idea of the end game. Maybe that is, I mean, so I do hear some tension between you as to that. Because do you feel more that we need to kind of agree about some future condition in order to motivate action or in order to ground our interventions?
Well, I mean, first of all, who's the we, right?
Oh, right. Sorry, I was going to try and not use that word.
No, I think the disagreement is very slight, and I actually think that those two positions are perfectly compatible, because I think that one vision of a future is, a future that's constantly negotiated. Mm-hmm. Here's a future in which you have a voice. Mm-hmm. Here's a future in which you get to sit in a General Assembly, mm-hmm. And be in conversation with your fellow citizens about what the future looks like. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That to me is a perfectly good vision of the future. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Judith?
Well, I'm just thinking that I think one of the tasks of movements is to open up the notion of the future in a way that's not a kind of cruel optimism in Lauren Berlant's sense, right? Mm-hmm. And I also think there's a different kind of cruelty to a static image of the future, which is anything that doesn't achieve that or lead to that clearly and immediately becomes devalued. And so, I mean, I worry about the paralyzing effect of certain fixed utopian notions. What I like about utopia is that it, of course, disorients us from what we take for granted in the present, and allows us to even ask the question, why do we limit our sense of possibility in the way that we do, or why is it limited for us in certain ways? What horizon can be opened up, well, through fiction or through utopian longings or through imaginary experiments that actually lead us to understand that what we've been accepting as a kind of firm limit is maybe not so necessary. But for, like, just to go back to Ni Una Menos for a moment, you know, that movement started as a set of parliaments on the street, right? Where people would come together and they would start to debate and propose actions and go back and forth and decide, you know, in unwieldy public parliaments, unsheltered and unwieldy, what kinds of actions to take and then to begin to take them. And that's an experiment in democracy that recalls actually the parliaments on the street in Buenos Aires after the dictatorship came down in the early 1980s, right? Those were experiments in democracy. They weren't backed by law, they weren't institutionalized, not yet, but they were ways of practicing democracy. And even, you know, in talking to the people in Turkey who signed the petition for peace and who are now going through these protracted and dismal trials, they have a set of networks that goes with each person to each trial. They work with one another in a form of networking, which is not the same as the massive street assembly, but is a form of support and solidarity that bespeaks another kind of sociality than the one that is mandated by that government. So it's an emergent sociality, it's an emergent solidarity. And sometimes those have to emerge, I don't want to say organically, because I don't really believe in that, but they emerge in the course of struggle so that something like public freedoms becomes more imaginable, even though there is a massive censorship against them in the Erdogan regime. And I think, so I guess what I'm suggesting is that if we could imagine in advance the exact world we want to realize, then we wouldn't have to go through the struggle of imagining together and creating together. And I think inadvertent and unexpected things happen, and that contingency is actually part of democracy. It's part of coming up against the unexpected wish of another, and it turns out we're going to live together in another way. I also think, you know, looking at certain anti-racist movements in Germany, I mean, look at the folks on the street. They're producing another image of the polity. They're producing another sense of what the polity should be, to some degree is, should be, must be, over and against the massive reactionary movements that are allowing Nazis into the parliament. Right. And I'm not going to go on about it unless you insist that I do, because I will become very emotional. Anyway, but I think we don't always know what that is, because from a singular standpoint, we can't say. There's no subject who can know that, because this is something that happens through exchange and through connections and being open to others in ways that are not fully predictable.
Right, right. And of course, struggles are often kind of defined, can be often defined in a reactionary way, responding to incidents. And Masha, you started your comments today by talking about changes in journalism and changes in notions of truth and what was permitted in Russia. And of course, those questions of truth and transformations of what counts as evidence or what can be argued in the age of Trump and Putin are, of course, very important issues for us today, and relate, of course, to things we've all been thinking about in this country. Also in the context of praxis, where we started with Hannah Arendt's quip from her essay on truth and politics. No one has ever doubted that truth and politics are on rather bad terms with each other, and no one, as far as I know, has ever counted truthfulness among the political virtues. And so the question is whether that's gotten worse, whether that situation has gotten worse, and how that has kind of motivated some of your work.
Well, I think that it's easier for me to not talk about sort of what has motivated my work, but to talk about how I sort of perceive what's happening with truth and politics. And it's funny because the things that stand out to me about that essay are not at all what's reflected in that quote. But she writes that that once obliterated, truth is almost impossible to restore.
Right.
And I think that that's something that is extremely important for journalists, especially, to keep in mind now. Right? It's the stories that we don't write are just as important as the stories that we do write, and in fact, the impact of the stories that we don't write, of the not writing of them, it can be huge, and it has to be a professional and ethical burden. And she also points out, quite intuitively, that that facts cannot be a matter of debate. And this is something that I feel we have to remind ourselves every day, right? And that reminder would have some pretty concrete consequences. I think that we sort of react to, by we I mean journalists, react to Trump's and to a lesser extent Putin's lies in some ways that don't that actually engage them in an argument about whether whether something is true or not. And the genre of fact-checking, which seemed so inventive a few years ago, right? Not fact-checking as a job, but fact-checking as a genre of journalism, I think is self-limiting and kind of useless because of that particular argument. And I think that it serves to actually obliterate the bigger story, which is how they lie, right, and what they lie for, by engaging with what they lie about. So, I think both Trump and Putin, and this is one of the ways in which they're remarkably similar. There are many ways in which they're very, very different, and I don't always love this comparison, but the one way in which they're remarkably similar is the way that they use lying, right? They lie like bullies. They lie to assert their right to say whatever they want whenever they feel like it. They lie to assert their power over reality itself. Mm-hmm. They lie to demonstrate who has the biggest microphone. And so, and that, for journalists, that's a really, really difficult thing to cover because we don't have the option of not covering it. It is a fact of our political life, and we can't, the sort of the facile, let's just ignore Trump's tweets, is a silly and useless kind of suggestion for journalists, although it's been proposed many times. But the moment you engage with the lie, you give it validity, which is exactly the power of lying in that particular way, right? And so we have to, we lose, right? We lose every time we engage with it, but perhaps we can reduce the damage. And I think that the way to reduce the damage is to always try to be writing a bigger story about how that lie is weaponized, right? And what the strategy behind the lie is, and not be seduced into this debate about facts.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Although it seems often that between the boundaries of kind of ignore the tweets completely on the one hand, or write about them and valorize them in some way just by kind of repeating them, and it's a difficult it's difficult to find that sweet spot where you would like to be, where we can actually talk about it in terms of what it is doing, what is the function of it, and how is power circulating as a result of it, without it being another form of, here's the latest tweet, right? Or without people just getting it as another reiteration of the latest tweet, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, it's a difficult job, and it's not, it's not particularly helped by the market media model, where one of the where even though we pay a lot of lip service to the idea that the media serve a public function and are a branch of power, a lot of the time decisions about how to cover it and when to how to cover something and when to cover something are based on who's going to cover it first.
Right. Judith.
Masha, I'm just thinking, well, first of all, I appreciated what you said, that the lie can be a way of asserting power over reality itself. Whatever I say reality is reality because I say it. And if I get others to go along with that as well, then it becomes a common reality that substitutes for any other possible assertion about what is real. I have the sense, well, I guess I have two questions about this. First of all, I think that the Trumpian lie, as it were, is a lie that happens in plain view. In other words, he knows damn well, or it's very clear that it's a lie, and the capacity or power to lie is part of the augmentation of power. He's beholden to no standards, to no norms. He's not constrained by ethics or law or empirical reality or anything of the sort. I mean, whatever can be, and there's an exhilaration in breaking those norms, right? The idea that you have to substantiate a claim, or that you have to, be internally consistent, or be able to answer an opposing view. I mean, it just strikes me as a kind of shameless unaccountability, and an exhilarating one.
Absolutely. The more blatant the lie is, the more power he has.
Yes, that's right. He could lie in the middle of Fifth Avenue and nobody would care. But my worry is also this, that I wonder if there's a way to think about truth and lie in politics without getting fascinated by the psychotic leader. In other words, I feel like that fascination deflects from other kinds of political analyses we need to be doing about detention camps, about social policy, about the abandonment of poor people in this country, about the foreign policy, about war. I worry that, I don't know how you feel about that, but I worry that that particular fascination with the psychotic liar, as it were, deflects from the kind of political work we need to be doing to develop another kind of movement or another kind of political culture to contest the authority or the allure of this particular regime.
I think it's hard for me to disagree with that argument. It's also hard for me to agree with it, because what I happen to be doing for a living is writing about either one or the other most of the time.
Yes.
But I mean, I think that the question is whether the focus or the emphasis on the extraordinary nature of the lying, right, serves as a form of distraction that means that we don't spend enough time on those substantive issues of politics. For instance, the fact that drone strikes are up under the I was going to say under the Obama. They had gone up under the
Yes.
Obama administration.
They were.
They were, very much so, but have continued to even go to greater levels, right? And so the question really is whether those, the discourse over the extremity of the lie is covering all of these other issues, or crowds out, or takes all the
It's not so much the lie, it's the man who lies. And it's the power of the man who lies, shamelessly and in public. So I think that's where fascination is. I don't think we're fascinated by the lie itself. And I think also, and this is a question for journalism, it seems to me if we say facts are facts, they're not debatable. We're surely right, but we have to settle facts, right? Lawyers talk about settling the facts of a case. Even scientists talk about deciding on the elementary facts. In other words, facts have to be presented, they have to be demonstrated, they have to be, they depend on their presentation for their plausibility. So it's not as if they're immediately transparent, right? So there has to be a way of working on the presentation of facts so that they arrive at a non-debatable place. And sometimes I think that converts for some people into a form of positivism. Well, the facts are facts, you can see them, they're clear, we can't deny them, da, 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 da. No, you actually have to show climate change. Like, let's make it absolutely persuasive and let's establish it as fact, let's establish it as science. Scientists have to be able to write in public. We need people who can write and translate what's happening in science to a wider public. You know, sexual violence is a fact. It's a systemic fact. What do we mean by that? We have to show, right? There's a real burden of demonstration and presentation and communication. So there's no way to get out of the rhetorical scene in which fact and truth are presented, but that doesn't make it relative. It just means that we have to be mindful of what it means and to present in a particular historical time and in a particular language in order to gain the kind of consensus we need to rebut revisionism, to rebut falsification of the kind we see. So, you know, I would like to see us, and I actually believe media journalism, I mean, that's where this is happening. You know, that's where the presentation is happening, the persuasive one. So it can't just be a kind of simple assertion, but you know this already, but I'm just saying it out loud. Okay.
So let me bring in some questions from the audience. And the first one has to do with the momentum that we were talking about, the possibility of momentum in action. And the question is really about whether there's a transnational level or possibility to the momentum. How transnational do you envisage the momentum in this global era? And to what extent would transnational collective momentum challenge, say, totalitarianism or authoritarianism in any one particular location? Our member of the audience is thinking of a momentum across borders, or maybe momentum sans frontières, right? What do you think of that? Maybe we'll start with you.
Oh, well, I do think that actually the Ni Una Menos movement, which is not the only movement, there are many feminist movements throughout Latin America, and there are many feminist movements that are about to burst on the scene, I think tomorrow at about 10 a.m., as far as I can tell, you know. But I worry that the national frame limits our imaginaries in ways that are really problematic, and that we do need transnational solidarities. But I'm noting people from South Africa going to Brazil and back again to talk about the history of racism, or what is decolonial pedagogy in politics, or people in Turkey who are trying to do transnational solidarity against encroaching authoritarianisms. I know people who are working on populism across borders in order to get a sense of its global parameter and what's translatable and what's not across languages and regions, because not everything is. Coming out of the dictatorial tradition, for instance, in South America is not quite the same as the feminist movement in the North. And sometimes when I see those particular encounters, I realize how class-specific feminism has been and how it has not necessarily been linked to a broader left politics or even to an anti-authoritarian politics. So, you know, that's you know, we also have to like look at what those limits are. But yes, I think that keeping an imaginary within the nation frame is a problem. It's a problem for a number of different issues, and I'm all for moving beyond it.
What do you think, Masha, in terms of in your own work, and have you seen this notion? Go ahead.
Of course, I mean, and I think we've all seen it if we bother to look. Occupy was part of a global phenomenon. There are movements now that I've been reporting on, like the new municipalism, which is definitely cross-border. And I think that also the cross-border nature of these movements is part of their power, because totalitarianism in particular is isolating. Any kind of autocracy or budding autocracy makes people provincial, right? And so linking ideas and actions across borders is also a way of resistance in itself.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of those autocracies, another question is how to deal with, and the question is, what do you think can be done to counter apolitical or politically apathetic features in modern societies? And the question was, how do autocrats like Orban or Putin get away with their anti-democratic institutional restructuring? So maybe a question about like how to counter political apathy, say, which contributes then to forms of autocracy.
I don't know. I'm a journalist. It's very hard for me to be prescriptive. I have no idea how to counter political apathy. I think it may be. I think that the question may be posed a little unfairly, certainly to Hungarians and Russians, because a lot of the successes, a lot of Putin's success is achieved through violence. It is not only taking advantage of political apathy, and so I think that's a somewhat facile way to ask the question.
Yeah, I also think, I mean, apathy is a term that I'm not fully convinced by. I think what we sometimes call apathy is fear, or terror, or hopelessness, cynicism, nihilism. It can be a number of different things depending on what you're seeing, but people don't move into political engagement for a lot of different reasons, and maybe finding out more in any given context what those reasons happen to be will help those who are politically active to learn about how they might reach people who otherwise feel quite estranged by the existing domain of politics. It might actually be a form of estrangement, and we might need to think about that and not just assume it as a subjective condition or disposition of some kind.
Or it might be the wrong kind of desire, right? I mean, it could be desire for autocracy, right? I mean, back to Deleuze and Guattari, and it was not an accident. There was desire for fascism, right? So, I mean, that's another variable that we probably need to put in there as well. Violence, but there may also be.
Well, then probably it's not apathy. There's probably a lot of pathos, some fascist pathos going on in that case.
So, and you were saying you're not prescriptive because you're a journalist. So maybe how we can end is that You've got a piece coming on online. We don't know if it already came online yet.
It's probably, we've been talking for
Probably
so long.
online. We've been talking about- So,
I've probably
so here's
published 2 columns.
here's the preview of the piece. You want to give us a quick preview of the piece?
No, absolutely not. And don't ever ask a writer to do that. No.
All right, so we're coming to the close of this panel, and so I invite you to read Masha's article, which is going to be online on the New Yorker any moment, or probably already is online, and addresses some contemporary issues that might be of relevance, particularly today. Do you have any closing thoughts to grace us with, perhaps, before we turn to our writing exercise?
I guess I just wanted to say a couple of things. One is simply that it's an honor to be here with Masha, and as some of you may know, she was one of those activists in Russia who was pamphleting and struggling at the most basic level to get the word out about gay and lesbian human rights during a time when the repression was super high. So I feel like you've been on all sides of you've done the mimeographing in the early years, and you're also now the established journalist who's getting the word out in other ways. So it's great, and our lives intersected almost because we were involved at different stages of the International Lesbian and Gay Human Rights Commission back in the day. So one conversation we could have had, and maybe still will have, is about the politics of human rights and how we think about that today. I also just wanted to say that I think that there's something about this gathering which is good today because we're living in this world in which this hideous hearing is taking place. I know you worked on it this morning, and I'm trying to write something as well, but I believe that we have to continue to speak about it because one of the salient features of this judiciary hearing is the way in which sexual violence is normalized. Not just the guys will be guys, but proceedings will be proceedings. And also, I was struck, and I'm going to go over a little bit, if you don't mind, I'm disobedient. But I was struck by the fact that the representation of Kavanaugh as this regular, white guy who comes from a good preppy background, that was supposed to be a defense. That was supposed to be, right? That was supposed to be, no, I drink beer. I still drink beer. I drink beer with my friends. I like sports. I still go to sports. And the moment, in a way, it was trying to say, look, I'm a normal guy. I'm the guy you know. I'm doing what every other guy is doing. This is guyness. This is guyness as we know it, right? You know this, you understand this. And that was supposed to be an alternative view of him, right? So that we're supposed to understand that sexual assault doesn't happen in life trajectories such as those, right? So he's using, in some sense, class, masculinity, and race to build this composite story, which is supposed to exclude the possibility of sexual violence, which becomes, by the way, poor or working class, black, and not a good guy, right? Not the right masculine, right? It doesn't have to be said. It's being produced there. But what I think is that what we got to see was that, sexual assault is actually being confessed as part of the trajectory of this form of white moneyed masculinity. This is part of the trajectory. This is what guys do. They laugh when women are being assaulted. They laugh while assaulting them. They barge into the room to see somebody having sex, to shame them. They threaten them. They physically coerce them. In other words, that is part and parcel of the becoming man, we might say, the gender formation within that matrix. And I actually think there's a way to read what we saw as actually giving us both sides of the same story. And that means resisting what so many journalists did, which is to say, well, she's credible and he's not, or he's credible and something happened to her, but I don't know who did it, right? I mean, when you start with the question, who do you believe, then you start debating that question rather than actually understanding how the narrative is being constructed so that we're supposed to understand these opposing views as actually separate stories, when actually they are two sides of the same story that never gets told. And I also think there's a dynamic between of violence and deniability, that the linking of violence and deniability again and again. He links violence and deniability in the story. She reports on the denied violence. They then proceed to deny the violence or acknowledge it, but set it aside, because after all, he's a good guy, and he has a character, and he likes beer, and he goes to sports. Right? I mean, in a way, I think the logic of if we ask, well, how is it that sexual violence gets reproduced so systemically? It gets reproduced precisely because the deniability is built into the narrative, and that's what we had a chance to see. And I worry that, it's not you, because you're fab, but I worry that the journalistic framework kind of takes us, it takes us away from understanding the way the entire logic was displayed. And we have to learn how to read, which is why we still need the humanities, by the way.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you very much. And now I think I'm going to turn the floor over to Marianne, who's going to help us in an exercise of drafting. Is that right?
We're going to follow this with an action, of course. It has to be done. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you.
To this panel, which was fantastic. And to all the speakers and to the audience, and especially one more time to Catherine Lasota, a huge hand. So we're going to project our wordsmithed and edited text and some addenda, and we're going to adopt it. I don't know by what mechanism exactly. If someone has a suggestion of a process, I would appreciate it. And we're going to take a photo, which our artists would like to choreograph. What? You have to come up here. I can't hear you.
I'm saying it's not the newest version.
It's not the newest version. Catherine, this is not the newest version. Is Catherine there? The issue was that the later version was so long it wouldn't fit on a page, so we were trying to make 2 pages, and I actually really wanted to listen to the conversation rather than edit the text, so I only got it like 2 minutes ago when I finally looked at my phone, because I didn't want to look at my phone while Judith and Masha and Bernard were speaking. It's coming, it's coming. It's very long. So let's read this version. I don't think it's going to be that different. I don't know. Tess is not here. So let's read this for a minute and then 5 minutes? Okay. And do our artists know how we're going to set up for this photo? What? Yeah, can we just put up, is there a way to put up the new one?
Or maybe Tess, why don't you read aloud the new one while we're looking at the old one? It's not there.
I have the new one. I have no idea what the changes were.
I didn't make the changes. I made this, so I don't know. Yeah, let me make this one. Tess made it. So I think it says, several hundred students, teachers, artists, activists, people read this, scholars, people from the community. Yeah, like, it's little changes like that. But
I have the new one right here. Would you like me to read it? We, several hundred students, teachers, writers, artists, activists, scholars, community members, privileged and disempowered alike, gathered together today to think, reflect, and act on the theme of what we can do when there's nothing to be done for the 10th anniversary Symposium of the Center for the Study of Social Difference at Columbia. We have spent the day together critically thinking about what we can do to advance social justice through various forms of political action and modes of protest. All the while, we have felt outraged at the political developments today in this country just outside these walls. We protest the disrespect and disregard for women displayed by the Republican men of the Senate Judiciary Committee and by the current administration more generally. We strongly oppose the possible confirmation of Judge Brett Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court. We are horrified by the structures that promote a man with such low ethical standards, a man accused of violently assaulting women, who supports policies that violate the rights of so many people, and who has apparently misrepresented various aspects of his past and other dealings and demonstrated a severe lack of judicial temperament. We pledge to act to oppose his confirmation. We are committed to solidarity and justice for all. So that's the statement. And then there are two appendices to this document, an addendum with 5 pledges and a photo performance, which we're going to do soon, to illustrate the support of the resistance this document represents. The addendum below summarizes 5 ideas that emerged from today's proceedings and that we pledge to carry with us beyond the privileged bounds of the space we occupy today. This is both a call to action and a reminder that action can be done. Number 1, we can do something even when there seems to be nothing to be done. 2, if capable, we can and should utilize our privilege and the spaces we occupy to facilitate resistance, even in the face of presumed hopelessness or pessimism. The two are not to be conflated, in friends. 3, we acknowledge the power of small gestures to lead to acts, to lead to movements. 4, we will, quote, resist temptation to return things to normal, end of quote. 5, quote, to change the world, we must also be changed. These are wonderful quotations from our speakers today. So these are the addenda. And Tess, are you here? Did you mean for the statement itself to end with solidarity and then the addenda to be separate? Yeah. Do we want to adopt this statement as the sentiment of the room? Yes. Can we have some consensus on that? I don't think we can now do small edits, but if you have edits to propose, email, and we can, a little group of us will think about them and, take your suggestions as we can. The group that drafted it will remain a drafting group, and thank you, Tess, Gil, Bernard, Elisa, and others who were sitting near them. So is there consensus that we adopt this? Yes. Aye. Okay. Okay, photo performance to go with this. So we have 3 causes. One is to gather in our multiplicity to adopt the statement and put our bodies into the picture. Second, we want to send a message to Turkey to and whoever would like to participate in that, please join us. We will put another slide behind us. To Osman Kavala, who is a wonderful activist, supporter of the arts, supporter of minority causes, Armenian, Turkish, who has been in prison now for how long? 10 months, just for doing all of this good work. And there are groups around the world who are sending a message of solidarity to him for his birthday. So people who would like to participate in that should. And in terms of the Brazilian movement, some people talked to me in the previous break, wondering whether our photo could also join their hashtag and appear in solidarity with them. So does anybody object to any of these causes? We could just take maybe this photo and then another one for Osman Kavala, and this one could also be used, or maybe one without the text for our Brazilian solidarity freedom cause. So how are we doing the photo?
Speak up. Yeah, could we add one more photo or one more thing to the new sanctuary movement against these deportations? Yes.
One for the sanctuary movement and against these deportations, yes. How are we setting up the photo? Maria Jose, Diana?